The first thing marveled when she came back from the dead was the sound of something breathing that didn't have lungs. It was low and rhythmic, like the tide pulling back over gravel, and it seemed to come from everywhere at once. The walls, the ceiling, the fluorescent lights that buzzed and flickered above the trauma bay. She was on her back on the floor when she realized she'd fallen. The defibrillator paddles were still in her hands, the charge long spent, and across the room the alien body they'd brought in from the crash site was silent on the gurney. Still, whatever had been sent inside it wasn't anymore. It was inside her. She didn't know that yet. She lay there while the crash team crowded around her, while Dr. C pressed 2 fingers to her carotid artery, while someone said her name over and over in that careful way people used with the dying. She heard all of it through what felt like water. Then she heard something else, a sound under the sound, a language beneath the noise of the trauma bay, and behind her eyes she saw a sky she had never seen before. Amber. 3 moons. A city made of something that wasn't stone or metal, rising in curved spires from a plain of deep red grass. Mara. Osi's voice. Sharp Mara, stay with me. She blinked. The amber sky dissolved. She was on the floor of Mercy General's Trauma Bay 2, 31 years old, an emergency physician 6 years out of residency, and something vast and ancient had just walked through her like she was a door left open. I'm here, she said. Her voice came out strange to her, too calm. I'm here, I'm okay. She was not okay. The alien had arrived in a military transport 6 hours earlier, strapped to a titanium gurney, and wrapped in a containment field that smelled like ozone and scorched copper. The MPs who delivered it said nothing except that it had been recovered from the secondary crash site near Holloman Air Force Base, that it was biological, and that it was dying. They handed her a laminated card with emergency contact protocols and a number that turned out to reach a recording. Then they left. It had 3 arms, the alien. The left 2 were longer than its body, folded against its sides, in what might have been rest, or might have been the last position they'd fallen into when it lost consciousness. Its skin was the color of old pewter and moved slightly, subtly, like something underneath it was restless. It had no visible eyes that Mara could identify. Only a smooth ridge of tissue across the upper third of its face, faintly luminescent, that seemed to track her movement as she circled the gurney. She'd read the reports from Holloman. She knew the first contact protocols. Everyone in medicine did by now, 3 years into the arrival. She knew the Vihari, as xenobiologists had taken to calling them, communicated through something that human instruments could only describe as structured electromagnetic resonance. She knew they were interstellar, that they had been watching Earth for a period that predated recorded human history, and that their mission to this particular planet was still classified at a level she didn't have access to. She didn't know what to do with a dying one. She tried everything she knew. Vitals are the closest approximations her equipment could manage. She ran the portable spectral analyzer that Mercy General had received from the DoD 6 months ago, for exactly this contingency, received and never used, because the aliens who'd come since the arrival had all been healthy, all been remote, and none had ever needed an emergency physician in a desert hospital in New Mexico. The resonance readings were dropping. The pattern of whatever the alien was doing internally, the thing the DoD analysts had decided to call its metabolic field, collapsing on itself, like a building with its supports knocked out. She watched those numbers fall on the analyzer's screen and felt the specific helplessness she'd trained herself not to show. The helplessness of watching someone die of something you don't have the tools to treat. Stay with me, she said to it. The same thing she said to every patient she was losing. An old habit. Useless. Human. The luminescent ridge across its face pulsed once, twice, times in rapid succession. Then it flatlined. She called for the defibrillator out of pure reflex, because her hands knew what to do even when her mind was catching up. The crash cart arrived. She charged the paddles. She pressed them to the places on the alien's thorax that the spectral analyzer had flagged as containing the highest concentration of bioelectric activity. She fired. The charge traveled through her instead of the patient. Nobody understood why afterward. The crash team's best theory was interference between the defibrillator's field and whatever residual electromagnetic resonance was still emanating from the alien body. All Mara knew was that she went down hard, that the lights went out, and that when they came back on the amber sky was waiting. She told no one. Not for the first 3 days. She went home the night of the incident with a clean EKG and a note in her chart about electrocution and a physician on mandatory rest leave. She sat in her apartment and watched the visions come and go like weather, and left the same way, sometimes lasting 30 seconds, and sometimes lasting long enough that she lost track of where she was and had to be pulled back by the sound of her own phone ringing. They were always the aliens' memories. She understood that by the second day, though understanding it didn't make it any less vertiginous. She was seeing what it had seen. She was inside its experience the way you were inside a dream. Present, sensory, convinced, and what it had experienced was enormous. It had traveled for what Mara's best guess put at something equivalent to 11 human years to reach this system. It had a designation she couldn't pronounce, but that she felt as a sensation, the way you feel a low note in your chest rather than hearing it. In her mind, she called it something without a word, a concept that was closest to witness. Because that was what it had come to do. The Vihari were not conquerors, not diplomats, not scientists in any human sense of the word. They were archivists. They had been cataloging intelligent civilizations for a span of time that Mara's mind kept sliding off of like a hand sliding off wet glass, something so long it had no name in any human language. They cataloged civilizations before they ended. That was the fourth day's vision, and it was the one that stopped her cold. She was standing in her kitchen with a cup of coffee, going cold in her hand, watching the amber sky again, watching that city of curved spires, and she understood. Not heard, not read, not was told, but understood the way you understood your own name. That the Vihari did not arrive to observe the living. They arrived to document the dead. Every civilization they'd cataloged had been on the way out. They came at the end, gathered what they could, preserved the record, and moved on. In 11,000 documented cases across a span of the galaxy that dwarfed anything human astronomy had charted, they had never witnessed a civilization survive. The pattern was too established. The pattern was the point. Intelligent species reached a threshold, collapsed, and became part of the archive. Earth was next. She called the number on the laminated card. She got the recording. She called her contact at the DoD liaison office, a man named Calloway, who had a bureaucrat's gift for sounding both urgent and evasive, and told him she needed a meeting immediately. He said the soonest he could arrange was 3 days out. She said that wasn't going to work. He said he understood her concerns and would escalate the request. She hung up and stared at the cold coffee. Then she drove to the crash site. His name was Dev Harkin, and he'd been the lead investigator on the Holloman secondary site since the morning after the crash. He was not happy to see her. He was a tall man with the economical movements of someone who'd spent years in too many small spaces. A submariner billed in a civilian suit, slightly too aware of the walls around him. He had dark circles under gray eyes and a styrofoam cup of gas station coffee that he treated with the reverence of something much better. When Mara presented her DoD liaison credentials at the site perimeter, a sergeant checked them, made a call, and then looked at her with the specific expression of a man who's been told not to turn someone away, but also not to help them. "Dr. Harkin will want to know why you're here," the sergeant said. "Tell him I was the attending physician who treated the alien. Tell him I have information about what it was doing here that he doesn't have." Dev Harkin appeared at the perimeter 15 minutes later. He looked at her the way she imagined he looked at most things. Steadily, without commitment. What information? Not out here. He considered her for a moment the way you considered a locked door when you weren't sure if you had the key. Then he lifted the perimeter tape and let her through. The crash site was a scar in the high desert, a long gouge of displaced earth and melted silica that the military had covered with a temporary structure of white polymer sheeting. Under the sheeting, technicians in yellow suits moved around the wreckage with instruments Mara didn't recognize. The alien craft, or what remained of it after the crash and the 3 days of excavation, was smaller than she'd expected. Roughly the size of a city bus, shaped like something that had been built without concern for aerodynamics, because aerodynamics were an afterthought for something that traveled between stars. "It sent a signal," she said. Harkin stopped walking. Or after impact? After, I think after. She pressed her fingers to her temple, the gesture automatic by now. The visions didn't respond to pressure, but her hand kept going there anyway. It sent a data burst to the rest of its kind. What it had gathered here. Everything it observed about us. Like a last transmission. An archive upload. We detected the transmission, he said carefully. We didn't know what it contained. It contained us. Every pattern they could extract about human civilization, behavioral, biological, technological, a record of what we were, past tense. She looked at him. They thought we were already done. The silence between them was long and specific. Above the polymer sheeting, the New Mexico sky was a hard, clean blue, the kind of blue that looked painted. How do you know this? He said. Not a question. An evaluation, she told him. All of it. The defibrillator, the visions, the 11,000 cataloged civilizations, the pattern. She watched his face while she talked. He was good. He kept it professionally neutral through most of it. But something shifted in his eyes around the part about the archive, a small tightening that she recognized as the expression of someone doing rapid calculations. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. He turned his styrofoam cup in his hands. Looked at the wreckage. If the signal already went, he said, then they know we're here, and they know what we looked like when it was sent. Yes, and they thought we were finished. Based on every precedent they've ever observed, yes. He looked at her, so either they were wrong or they weren't. Or, she said, they get a different transmission, a correction. It took her 11 days to talk Calloway into a meeting that included more than Calloway. 11 days of visions, more detailed now, as though whatever the witness had given her was still sorting itself out, arranging itself into sequences she could follow. She learned things in those 11 days that no xenobiologist had yet theorized, and that she had no framework to fully process except to write them down, long dense notes, in the legal pads she bought 6 at a time from the pharmacy on 6th Street, filling them with the closest English approximations she could find for concepts that didn't map cleanly onto any human language. She learned that the Vihari were not cruel. This was important to her for reasons she examined carefully, because it would have been easier, in some ways, if they were. Cruelty would have been simple, something to push against. But the witness had not come with malice. It had come with the absolute certainty of an astronomer charting the death of a star. A death that was happening, that was inevitable, that was worth documenting, but not worth mourning in any excessive way. Because the universe was full of dying stars, and the archive was the point. The archive was everything. She also thus learned that the Vihari could receive transmissions as well as send them. The archive was not static, could be updated. Harkin came with her to the meeting. He'd spent the 11 days running his own parallel process, reading her notes, consulting with the 2 xenobiologists the DoD had on retainer, and quietly assembling a team of people whose specific skills he did not fully explain to her, but whose presence, when they were all finally in the same room in a conference facility outside of Albuquerque, told her a great deal. Physicist, a signals engineer, a woman from the State Department who had the composed, watchful quality of someone who negotiated for a living, a Marine colonel who said almost nothing and absorbed everything, and a linguist named Dr. Sato, who had been working on Vihari electromagnetic resonance patterns since the arrival, and who, when Mara explained what she'd learned about the archive and its update capability, went very still for a long moment, and then said, "That's consistent with the secondary signal pattern we picked up from the Holloman site. We couldn't identify it as distinct from the primary transmission. But if you're right, the channel is still open." "How open?" Harkin said. "Theoretically, as open as we can make it." The room was quiet. The air conditioning hummed. Outside the windows the desert was orange, and still in the late afternoon light. Mara put both hands flat on the table. "Then we send something back." She expected argument. She got logistics, which was almost the same thing, but moved faster. The problem was not the physics, which was Sato's domain, and which he attacked with the specific joy of a man who has waited 3 years for exactly this problem. Problem was not the signal engineering. The problem was not even, as she'd feared, the military. Turned out to have their own reasons for wanting the Vihari archive to contain a different picture of humanity. The problem was what to send. They had the transmission channel. They had, in theory, the means to append something to the archive, to add to the witness's record, to slip something into the data stream that was still, 11 days later, propagating outward through the electromagnetic corridors that the Vihari used the way humans used fiber optic cable. They had a window, Sato estimated, of perhaps another 3 weeks before the signal degraded beyond reach. What they did not have was agreement on what humanity's correction should look like. It was the State Department woman. Her name was Reyes. She offered it on the second day, like it was a small deliberate gift, who first articulated the problem clearly. The archive apparently contains a record of what we were when it was compiled, she said. A static picture. You're proposing we add a dynamic one. Dynamic in what sense? We choose what we send. We're making an argument about what humanity is. That's not a scientific question. It's not only a political one either, Harkin said. No, Reyes agreed. It's both, which makes it the hardest kind. Mara had been listening. Now she said, the witness had a concept in what it gave me. I keep coming back to it. She pressed her fingers to her temple, automatic. The archive isn't a history, it's a diagnosis. They observe, they assess, they categorize. Every civilization they've documented fits into a pattern of progression and collapse. What I'm saying is, the Vihari think they know what we are. They've seen 11,000 versions of what we are. Their certainty is not arrogance. It's evidence-based. So we send evidence that contradicts it, the physicist said. We send proof that we don't fit the pattern. The Marine colonel, had not spoken in 2 days of meetings, said, we've never fit the pattern. Everyone looked at him. He was a compact man named Walsh, silver-haired, with the unhurried authority of someone who'd long since stopped needing to perform confidence. He had a coffee cup he'd been refilling since day one. He put it down now. Every civilization that went into their archive, he said, was done, finished. When they arrived to document it, it was already over. What we're sitting in right now, this room, this conversation, the fact that we got a dying alien's memories. And instead of panicking, we're having a technical meeting about signal propagation and diplomatic messaging. This isn't how something finished behaves. He picked up his coffee. Send that. Sato had a colleague, a woman named Dr. Faruqi, had spent the better part of the arrival's 3 years developing what she called a resonance translation layer, a method of converting human informational content into the electromagnetic pattern structure that the Vihari used for data storage. She had never tested it on a live signal. She had never had a second signal to test it on. She arrived in Albuquerque on the 4th day after the meeting, driving a rental car that smelled like fast food, and carrying 2 hard drives and a portable signal amplifier. And she looked at the problem the way Mara imagined people had once looked at the first machines for heavier-than-air flight, equal amounts of terror and hunger. It'll be lossy, she said immediately. The translation isn't clean. Human concepts don't have one-to-one mappings to Vihari data structures. We'll be approximating, filling in gaps. The recipient will have to interpret the gaps. That might be fine, Mara said. Why? Because interpretation means engagement. You don't interpret something you've already filed away. Faruqi looked at her for a moment. Then she opened one of the hard drives and got to work. Preparation took 8 days. Mara was present for all of it. She slept in 4-hour intervals on a cot in the corner of the signals lab and ate what was put in front of her, and kept the visions coming by a discipline she'd developed in the first 11 days. A kind of receptive stillness, a deliberate quieting of the noise in her mind that let the witness's memories surface more cleanly. She used them as a reference. When Faruqi's translation hit a gap, a concept that had no Vihari equivalent, Mara would press her fingers to her temple and reach back into the amber sky memories and find the closest structural analog that the witness's experience offered. They worked like a translation team working across 2 dead languages with only 1 living speaker. The content itself was the subject of long and sometimes heated discussion. Reyes wanted historical documentation, evidence of humanity's capacity for cooperation at scale, treaties, institutions, the UN protocols that had governed the post-arrival period. Walsh wanted military capability. Not aggressive, he was specific about that, but the clear demonstration of a species that could defend itself, that was not passive. The physicist wanted pure mathematics. Sato wanted the Renaissance recordings of human music because his analysis of Vihari signal architecture suggested that the closest structural analog in human culture was complex polyphonic composition, and he thought it might translate better than any of them expected. Mara listened to all of them. Then she said, "Send everything." There was a silence. Every civilization in the archive, she said, probably sent something representative, something curated, a best face. What do you put in a time capsule? Your achievements, your art, your highest expression. She looked around the room. Send that too. But also send what we actually are. Send the field hospital footage from the last earthquake. Send the patent disputes. Send the argument my mother and I had at Christmas 2 years ago that she recorded on her phone and sent to my sister as a joke. Send the nursing home and the food bank and the broken infrastructure and the people who built something anyway. Send the mess. The Vihari have 11,000 data points on what a civilization looks like when it's a monument to itself. We might be the first one to show them what it looks like when it's still arguing. The room was quiet for a long time. The air conditioning hummed. Yes, said. That's either the most honest diplomatic message in human history or the most reckless. Both, Mara said. Send it. The night before transmission, she couldn't sleep. She lay on her cot in the corner of the signals lab and watched the ceiling and let the last of the visions come. They were quieter now than they'd been in the first days, the witnesses' memories settling like sediment, finding their final arrangement. She understood things she hadn't understood at the beginning. She understood that the witness had been afraid at the end. Not if dying was not something the Vihari feared the way humans did, though she couldn't have explained what they felt in its place. Only that it was different. It had been afraid that the archive would be incomplete, that it had not gathered enough, that the record of this small blue world would be inadequate. That inadequacy mattered in some profound way that it would not have been able to articulate in any human language. Spent its last moments trying to record more. That was what the final pulse of its luminescent ridge had meant. Not goodbye. Not surrender. It had been trying to work. She pressed her fingers to her temple and spoke to it, which she knew was irrational. It was dead. It had been dead for 3 weeks. What remained in her was a residue, an echo, kind of after-image that burned into your vision when you looked at something too bright for too long. You didn't get all of it, she said quietly to the ceiling to the echo, but we're going to send you the rest. The amber sky came one more time, clear and still. The 3 moons hung in their places. The city of curved spires caught the light of a sun she would never see. And underneath it all, beneath the alien landscape, she felt something that was not quite sorrow, and not quite wonder, but was built from the same materials as both. The witness had traveled 11 years to document the end of her world. It had been certain. It had been careful. It had done everything right. It had not expected to be wrong. Transmission day was gray and cold, an early winter front that surprised the desert, with low clouds and a thin wind that smelled like rain. The signals team set up at the antenna array they'd been granted access to through a chain of permissions that Reyes had quietly arranged over the previous 2 weeks. A radio telescope facility 40 miles outside of Albuquerque, its enormous dish angled at a precise bearing that Sato and Faruqi had calculated from the propagation vector of the original Vihari transmission. They would not be sending a radio signal, exactly. Faruqi's translation layer converted the human content into electromagnetic resonance patterns that used the same frequency structures the Vihari employed. But the antenna array was the amplifier, the means of pushing the converted signal strongly enough and precisely enough to reach a channel that was still, by Sato's best estimate, marginally open. There was a possibility it wouldn't work. Several possibilities, in fact. Faruqi had catalogued 17 distinct failure modes and addressed 12 of them. The remaining 5 were, in her word, philosophical. Mara stood at the edge of the antenna platform and watched the technicians work and felt the specific calm that came, sometimes, after a long decision had been made and could not be unmade. She had the last of her legal pad notes in her coat pocket. She'd brought them without knowing why. Some instinct about witnesses, about documentation, about the witness. Ken came and stood beside her with his gas station coffee. "What happens if it doesn't go through?" he said. Not a question. Asked the question already, a week ago. This was something else. Then we find another way, she said. We keep going. He nodded. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, you know what I keep thinking about? The 11,000 civilizations. All those records. Yeah, somewhere in that archive, there's a record of every single one of them. Their art, their science, their arguments, their messes, all of it. He turned the cup in his hands. Preserved. Not forgotten. She hadn't thought of it that way. She looked at the antenna array, the enormous dish aimed at a bearing 11 years of travel across the dark. We'd be adding to that, she said, as the first one that didn't end. The transmitter fired at 11:04 a.m. Mountain Standard Time. There was no drama to it. A series of confirmations on a monitor, a signal strength reading, a quiet announcement from Faruqi. We're on the propagation vector. Signal integrity is above threshold. Transmitting. And then nothing visible except the dish and the gray sky and the thin wind. They ran the transmission for 6 hours. Everything. History, and music and arguments and achievements and disasters and recoveries and the small human textures that Mara had insisted on. The laughter at the wrong moment, the stubborn, persistent, the way people kept trying to help each other in conditions that made helping nearly impossible. She had spent 2 days compiling the last category herself, pulling recordings and documents and transcripts, building a picture of what the witness had come to record at the end and missed because the end had not arrived. When it was done, Faruqi took off her headset and rubbed her eyes. Sato was very still. Walsh stood with his hands in his pockets and his face turned toward the now silent dish. Reyes made a call on her satellite phone very quietly in the corner. Mara walked out to the edge of the platform. The desert opened below her, wide and rust-colored and patched with scrub, the low clouds moving slowly east. She felt the absence of the visions the way you felt the absence of a sound that had been going on long enough that you'd stopped noticing it, somewhere between the transmission beginning and its end. The last of the witness's echo had settled completely. The amber sky was gone, stood in the cold air, and thought about 11,000 civilizations, preserved and complete in an archive, moving through the dark between stars. She thought about the pattern the Vihari had observed so long that it had become a certainty. The arc of intelligent life, observed across a span of galactic history that made time seem like a single afternoon. Birth, complexity, crisis, collapse. The archive waiting at the end. The witness arriving to document what remained. She wondered what it looked like from the other direction, inside the archive, looking out at the data stream, and watching something unexpected arrive. A civilization that had received the last transmission of a dying archivist had understood it and had responded. Not with a monument to itself, not with a curated best face, but with the whole complicated living argument of what it actually was. She wondered if 11,000 silent records suddenly had context they had not had before. She wondered if patterns broke. She pressed her fingers to her temple one last time, the gesture without an object, the habit that had outlasted its purpose. Then she put her hands in her pockets and turned back toward the lights of the facility. 3 months later, a signal arrived. It came through the same frequency structure they'd used for their transmission. She told them someone had read the message closely enough to understand the technical architecture. It arrived at Faruqi's monitoring array at 3:02 a.m. on a Thursday and triggered the alert protocol that had been running continuously since transmission day. By 4 a.m., Mara was on a call with Sato. By 4:30, Harkin was in a car heading for the facility. By 6, Reyes and Walsh were on a conference line. Faruqi was running the translation layer in reverse. The incoming signal was long, far longer than their transmission. 4 days of continuous processing to produce a partial translation that Faruqi and Sato agreed was sufficiently reliable to brief the assembled group on. It was not a reply. It was not the kind of communication that had a reply shape. What it was, as best they could determine, as best the resonance translation layer could render into human language concepts, was something between an addendum and an apology. A correction in the archive, a note appended to the record of Earth and by extension, to the structural framework the Vihari used to understand intelligent life. The closest approximation Faruqi's translation could produce of the central message was, We were here before the end, and the end did not come. This constitutes an anomaly. Anomalies are given their own notation. Mara read the translation 3 times. Then she read the final line. Sato had flagged separately with a note that said only. I don't have a better rendering than this. The final line, in the closest English equivalent that the translation layer could produce, said, the archive is corrected. We are listening. She put down the translation and looked out the window of the facility at the desert and the winter sky. Clear today, no clouds, the high blue of altitude and cold. She thought about an archive somewhere in the dark between stars, vast, patient, carefully maintained, containing the record of 11,000 civilizations that had not made it. And somewhere in that archive, a new notation, an anomaly. A species that had looked up at the archivist's last transmission and sent something back. Not a best face, not a monument. The real thing. The whole complicated, stubborn, still arguing, still building, still trying real thing. We are listening. She let out a breath. It fogged in the cold air. Behind her she could hear Harkin's voice and Reyes's voice and the signals team, moving with the quick, purposeful energy of people who understood that something significant had happened and were already figuring out what to do next. She could hear Faruqi on the phone with someone. The words, "We're going to need a bigger team," rising clearly above the other noise. She stayed at the window a little longer. She was not a sentimental person. She had trained herself not to be, the way you trained yourself not to feel the full weight of the losses in a trauma bay. Because the weight was real, but you had to keep moving. She'd learned to keep moving, but she let herself have this moment. Just this one. Somewhere between stars, a record had been corrected. An anomaly had been notated. The pattern that had held for 11,000 civilizations, the iron logic of the archive, had encountered the one thing it wasn't built for. Something that refused to be a monument to itself. Something that had looked at the certainty of its own ending and kept working. She thought of the witness on the gurney, the luminescent ridge pulsing in those last seconds. The effort to record more, to gather more, to not leave the archive incomplete, she thought. I know how that feels. She straightened up, put her hands in her pockets, turned around. All right, she said to the room, to the people already moving. Let's figure out what they said. Outside, the winter sky held its cold blue over the desert, and in a monitoring array, 40 miles away, the signal was still coming in, patient and vast and structured in patterns that human instruments were only beginning to learn to read. And humanity stood at the edge of something that had no name yet in any language anyone had spoken, and did what it had always done. It got to work.